Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
The glass of champagne in my hand felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of every single family gathering we had ever forced ourselves through was suddenly pressing down on that thin stem between my fingers. The room was full of chatter and clinking glasses, relatives crammed shoulder to shoulder around a long table that smelled of roasted meat, cheap wine, and too much perfume. I already knew the night would not pass without some little jab from my mother. It never did, but I did not expect her to raise her glass with that grin and deliver words sharp enough to slice through the laughter like a blade. "To my daughter," she said, her voice pitched high with the kind of mock cheer that sounds more like poison than praise. "You're not getting anything from me. You've always let me down." The room roared with uneasy chuckles, some of the cousins trying to soften the cruelty with their nervous laughter, others pretending they didn't hear it all. My mother's eyes, however, never left mine. She wanted me to flinch, to shrink back into that corner she had built for me my entire life. I didn't. I lifted my glass higher, forced the corners of my mouth into something that might have looked like amusement, and I took a slow sip. The burn of the champagne coated my throat, and then I answered in the calmest voice I could manage, "That's okay. I'm moving abroad permanently." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. It was like someone had shut off the music and stolen the air from the room all at once. My mother's smirk cracked into confusion, then froze altogether, her hand still hanging stupidly in the air with her glass half raised. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere to my right. One of my uncles let out a strange half-cough, half-laugh, as if he wasn't sure whether to make light of what I'd just said or demand clarification. For the first time in years, every single pair of eyes was on me, not her. And I can't deny that it felt good, better than good, almost intoxicating. But that line I threw out so casually, as if I had just thought of it on the spot, was not casual at all. It had been sitting in my mouth for months, waiting for the exact moment when it would slice through her control like glass under pressure. She thought she was still running the script, the way she always did. She mocks, I endure. Everyone else pretends not to notice. But I had rewritten the ending long before this dinner, and she was the only one still reading from the old version. The cousins started whispering, and I caught pieces of it. Is she serious? Moving where? Permanently. Like children gossiping in the back row of a classroom. My brother, the golden child who never paid for a single thing in his life, sat stiffly beside my father, his jaw clenched as if my words somehow threatened the shine on his perfect record of favoritism. My father tried to mask his discomfort with a sip of his drink, but the redness creeping up his neck betrayed him. He knew I wasn't bluffing, and he also knew that he hadn't done a damn thing to stop it. My mother, however, recovered quickly, or at least pretended to. She laughed a loud, high-pitched sound that didn't quite reach her eyes, and waved her hand like I had just told a bad joke. "Oh, stop being dramatic," she said, still clinging to the performance, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She wanted to brush it aside, but she couldn't shake the fact that her stage had been stolen out from under her. I let her words hang, didn't argue, didn't explain. Just smiled again and took another sip. The most dangerous thing in a family like mine wasn't shouting back, it was silence delivered at the right moment. Silence always unsettled her because it left room for doubt. And doubt is poison to control. But while they sat there, unsure whether to believe me, I knew exactly what was coming. They didn't know about the documents already signed, the lease terminated, the job offer accepted across the ocean. They didn't know about the savings I'd carefully protected while they laughed behind my back, while they called me the parasite, the disappointment, the waste. They didn't know that my one-way ticket was already tucked inside my wallet. I looked around the table, taking in their confusion, their unease, their shifting glances. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on edge. They were. They were wondering if I was bluffing, if I was angry enough to pull away for a week or two, maybe even a few months, but permanently? They couldn't wrap their heads around it. The thought of me not being there to fill the role they had assigned to me was unthinkable. I let them sit in it, savoring the discomfort, because I knew this was only the beginning. What none of them realized, what made me almost laugh into my glass, was that the toast my mother thought would be her victory lap was actually my starting gun. I had rehearsed this moment so many times I could almost predict their faces. And yet, watching the way my mother's smile faltered, watching the whispers ripple like cracks through the room, it was even better than I imagined. What I didn't say that night, not yet, was that they had given me all the ammunition I needed long before this party. Every nickname, every whisper, every time they let me pay for their celebrations only to turn around and mock me for being too eager. They thought I didn't know, but I always knew. And now, for once, they were the ones unprepared. As the silence stretched longer and my mother finally lowered her glass, her voice caught just slightly on the words she tried to force out next, I felt the moment harden into something permanent. There was no way back from this. I had let the truth slip into the open, and it was going to unravel more than just the party. What came next would change everything for them and for me. The moment the laughter died and the ambient music struggled to reassert itself, I realized that the room, with its glittering fairy lights and centerpieces that were really just mason jars pretending to be elegant, had shifted from celebration to surveillance because every person at that table had quietly turned from guests into witnesses. And there was nothing more thrilling than watching people who had treated me like a joke begin to wonder whether the punchline was actually a fuse they had already lit. I could feel my mother working through her usual playbook, the one with dismissal in Chapter 1 and guilt in Chapter 2 and a grand finale of forced hugs for the photos. Except tonight I was done being a prop, so while she tried to laugh it off I set my glass down, reached for my phone, and found the family group chat that had been a steady stream of demands, reminders, and passive-aggressive announcements dressed up as invitations, and I typed a single line that would read like a shrug to an outsider, but would feel like a grenade to everyone who lived off my silence. Since I've always let you down, I went ahead and canceled all the payments you count on me for, effective immediately, and just so no one gets confused, here are the screenshots. I dropped them into the chat, one after another, each image a tidy confirmation of the subscriptions and transfers that my mother had once framed as gracious help I was lucky to provide, but which in reality had become the invisible plumbing of their lives. Quietly paying for holiday deposits, a storage unit for the antiques that were apparently too precious to sell and too useless to display, the insurance for the car my brother refused to register in his own name, and the streaming services that were supposedly for family movie nights yet somehow charged premium add-ons for sports and reality show packages I never watched. Across the table, phones buzzed in a discordant chorus and heads dropped in the same embarrassed angle people wear when they pretend to check weather alerts while studying a scandal, and it was beautiful, that synchronized bow to their screens, because it told me I had finally placed a mirror in their hands and they were seeing themselves as I had seen them for years. While they scrolled, I felt the past slide in like a cold draft beneath the door, and I remembered how it started, not with a single betrayal, but with small negotiated surrenders that were always sold as family unity. Like when I was told that college would be easier if I went local and worked nights while my brother focused on his potential, or when Dad explained that helping with the mortgage for just a while would give us all breathing room, or when my mother told me I had a generous heart, and generous hearts prove it quietly by paying for things without making a scene. Every one of those moments became a stitch in a costume I never auditioned for. Until one day I looked down and realized I had sewn myself into the role of walking wallet and unpaid therapist and reliable scapegoat, and the thread had gotten so tight around my ribs that I could not take a full breath without feeling guilty for wanting oxygen. I used to console myself with small acts of rebellion, like buying a better coffee than I deserved on mornings after double shifts, or laughing at the sheer audacity of relatives who asked for a little more, just this once. But the joke wore thin the night I found a message thread where cousins called me the holiday sponsor and my mother, always the headline writer, referred to me as the dependable disappointment, which is the kind of phrase that sounds clever until you realize it is a campfire people gather around to roast pieces of you for warmth. So when she toasted to my failures and tried to make me carry the shame in front of the same audience that had fed off my efforts, I decided it was time to return the plates to the kitchen and lock the door, which is why, as they gaped at their screens, I kept my face neutral and my voice even and said I had been meaning to update everyone on a few administrative changes, and that since we were all together, now was as good a time as any to let them know the free trial had ended, the discount code had expired, and customer support was permanently offline. My mother, who prides herself on composure, reached for her phone and pretended she did not see it, but the color in her neck rose like a thermometer in a hot car, while my brother muttered something about timing and fairness, and Dad, poor man, tried to play diplomat with a speech about misunderstandings and family, yet even he could not disguise the relief and horror colliding in his eyes, because he had benefited like the rest, but he knew the arithmetic was obscene. I might have softened it, had they ever admitted the truth, but there is a point beyond which easing the blow is just letting the abuser keep the lights on, so I leaned forward and said that I would not be rewriting the budget for their convenience, and that I had taken the liberty of sending the cancellation confirmations to each of their personal emails so there would be no excuses, and, for good measure, I added a neat little spreadsheet that totaled the outflow for the past several years. Not to humiliate them, but to make the scale undeniable, because numbers arranged in columns have a way of stripping sentiment from exploitation and revealing the bones underneath. The room hummed with wounded pride and the kind of faux confusion that tries to masquerade as innocence, yet beneath it I sensed something new, a wary respect that you only earn when you draw a line with a permanent marker. It was not stupendous or cinematic, this revenge of mine, but it was exact and it was earned, and the best part was that it did not require me to raise my voice or deliver a speech. It simply required me to stop underwriting the lie and start underwriting myself, which felt like stepping out of a drafty house into sun after a long winter. My mother finally found her voice and told me this was petty and impulsive and beneath me, that families do not keep score, that I would regret burning bridges later, yet her eyes told a different story. Because behind the outrage lived a calculation twitching and adjusting to the new math, and calculations do not cry, they reorganize. I pushed my chair back, slow and quiet, and said I needed air, and as I walked toward the patio door with plates whispering against napkins and whispers cutting at my heels, I glanced at my phone and saw the read receipts pop up one by one. Then a single text from an unknown number that carried no name yet used a nickname only one person alive would dare employ, and it said, with a confidence that made my skin prickle, "We need to talk before you leave, because there is something you don't know. And she will never tell you." Out on the patio the air felt thin and electric, the kind of cold that does not bite so much as remind you that you have skin and bones and a pulse you can choose to follow, and while the noise of the dining room flattened behind the glass like a television left on low, I stared at the unknown number for a long beat, because whoever had used that old nickname knew a version of me that existed before I learned to carry my own weather, and then, without giving myself time to be cautious, I typed back that I was listening, that if this was a prank it was a poor one, and if it was a threat it had arrived 10 years late, and almost immediately the phone rang, bringing with it a voice that slid into my ear with a history I recognized before my mind supplied the name. It was Elaine, my mother's former friend and occasional nemesis from church committee days, a woman who had once organized food drives with a ferocity that frightened the deacons, who had vanished from our holidays after one spectacular falling out about a bake sale budget, and who now, with a steadiness that made me brace, told me she had proof that the story my mother tells about me is not the story she tells banks and attorneys, and that if I was indeed leaving the country I should know where certain missing pieces of my life had gone. I said we could meet at the curb under the maple whose roots were always cracking the sidewalk, and as I slid my phone into my coat I caught my reflection in the glass, realizing with a detached sort of humor that I looked like a woman who had finally swapped apology for intention, because my shoulders were down and my jaw was unclenched and I was not busy inventing explanations for other people's behavior. Elaine emerged from the neighbor's driveway as if she had been grown there, her sensible coat belted tight, her hair gathered without vanity, and she pressed a thick envelope into my hand with the kind of solemnity most people reserve for condolence cards, saying that when my grandmother died there was a fund that was not small, structured to pay for my education and whatever came after, a gentle net built by someone who knew this family would pull, and that over the years signatures had placed That net elsewhere with the justification of family need, and that I should read those signatures before I bought another ticket for anyone's convenience. I felt heat gather at the base of my neck, not the wild anger that begs for spectacle, but the clear, clean kind that lends detail to the edges of a plan, and I asked why she was telling me now, and her answer was simple enough to hurt. Because she had tried once before, and my mother had made sure I thought Elaine was a liar, and because leaving without knowing would be another theft disguised as a fresh start. Inside the house, the party had reconstituted itself into small knots of judgment, voices rising and falling in the familiar cadence of people pretending to be fine. And when I stepped back through the sliding door, I saw my mother at the head of the table with her hands folded in the posture of a judge about to deliver instructions to a jury, and I knew exactly how she would play it. With a story about hysteria and betrayal and my delicate nature, so before she could begin I clicked the remote on the mantel, opened the gallery on my phone, and with 2 taps sent the spreadsheet to the living room television, where it bloomed in neat columns taller than any defense she could improvise. Each row a date and a transfer and a memo line that made euphemism impossible, and for a full minute everyone just stared, no one pretending to check the weather now. My revenge in that moment was not noise but legibility, because when people who thrive in fog are forced to stand in daylight, they do not melt, they squint and reach for sunglasses and complain about the glare, and, while the room adjusted to the brightness, I picked up my glass and said in a voice that carried to the last folding chair in the back that the new policy in my office was radical transparency. The doorbell rang then with the kind of timing that would have seemed corny if it had not been purchased with years of planning, and the cousins made a path for me as I walked to the foyer. Already knowing what I would find, because I had set this in motion a week earlier when I understood that canceling my payments would not be enough if the obligations themselves were left to breed excuses. And when I opened the door, the moving crew stood on the porch with clipboards and polite smiles, ready to deliver every box from the storage unit I had been funding since the summer. My brother needed space for his collectibles, and my mother needed climate control for the antiques she would someday appraise but never sell. And I told the foreman to bring the crates right through, to stack them in the dining room under the light that made dust look like snow, and to set the transfer of billing authorization on the table beside the centerpiece so my mother could sign as soon as dessert was served. There was a gasp that started near the kitchen and traveled like a rumor, and I felt something in my spine click back into place as the men carried in the past, labeled carefully in my handwriting because I am foolish that way, careful even when I am being used. And I watched my mother's face work through disbelief into rage, because there is no quicker way to expose a con than to return the merchandise in front of the crowd that admired it. She asked me if I had lost my mind, and I told her no, that I had found it exactly where I left it, in the cold aisle of a storage facility on a night when I realized that safeguarding other people's treasures had cost me the softest parts of my own life. And that from now on ownership would follow possession rather than fantasy, and the crew chief, who had no stake in our drama, slid the papers toward her and pointed at the line where the new responsible party should write her name. My father coughed into his napkin, my brother muttered a prayer to the gods of lost convenience, and I, finally satisfied, excused myself with a smile that was not an apology and stepped back onto the patio with Elaine's envelope warm against my palm. Because the night had given me 2 gifts, one public and one private, and while the first had landed exactly where I intended, the second remained unopened, a sealed question waiting for an answer that might rewrite everything I thought I knew about how this family built its house. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a quiet intruder, thick with the weight of paper that had been kept from me for years, its edges slightly softened by handling that was not mine. And while the house around me exhaled the perfume of cardboard and packing tape and the last load of laundry I intended to run on this side of the ocean, I slid it open with the butter knife that had outlived 2 apartments and too many New Year's resolutions, letting the contents spill into neat stacks. The way files surrender when the cabinet is finally unlocked, and what I found there was not a dramatic bomb so much as a precise ledger of quiet decisions that, taken together, explained why certain doors that should have opened for me had always groaned and stuck. Because the papers documented, in legal language that put a polite gloss on theft, a fund my grandmother had established with the kind of foresight that seems severe until you need it, a fund that was meant to protect the next part of my life from exactly the sort of family weather I had grown up inside, a fund that, according to the dates and signatures, had been redirected in careful increments toward obligations that wore my mother's handwriting and my brother's convenience like identical suits. I followed the trail with the kind of attention that arrives once shame has left the room, tracing dates back to the spring I chose my local college because everyone insisted we could not afford out-of-state tuition. Then forward to the fall when I took a night job to help with the mortgage that apparently needed my help only during my semesters and not my brother's gap year. Then sideways to the months when I covered holiday deposits as a gesture of love while transfers labeled emergency. Family expense quietly paid for a kitchen remodel whose cabinets still creak when opened because expensive does not mean careful, and because careful was never the point. There were letters from the bank stamped with approval and warmth. There were emails that sang the praises of a responsible trustee whose stewardship impressed the investment team. There were scanned forms bearing signatures I recognized intimately and one I did not. A tight, confident script that belonged to a person who has always believed that a clean line and a quick wrist are enough to make a document true, and as I sat with the evidence arranged like a crime scene that politely refused to call itself one, I understood the shape of my next move with a clarity that felt less like anger and more like architecture. The phone calls started before 9, because drama never sleeps in a house that feeds on it, and the first was my father deploying his best soft-voice diplomacy about misunderstandings and haste and the heartache of rash decisions, followed by my brother who murmured something about timing and family privacy and the outrageous rudeness of the moving crew who had parked their truck so that his friends could not pull into the driveway, and finally my mother with her queenly pause and her accusation that my behavior had humiliated her in front of people whose approval she pretends not to value, at which point I let them stack their words until the tower leaned, and then I told them, in a tone I saved for invoices and breakups, that my calendar for the week was full and that any conversation should be addressed to the counsel whose name and number I would be happy to provide after I returned from my errand, which happened to involve the trust office of a bank that was very interested in the difference between stewardship and consumption, and the moment the line went silent I pictured her sitting at the kitchen island with her lips pressed so tight they might never relax again. Because nothing chills a tyrant faster than realizing the clerk they relied on has their own attorney and a copy machine. At the bank the trust officer read the documents with the kind of attentive frown that belongs to people who have seen every version of family virtue, then excused himself and returned with a compliance manager whose politeness felt like a locked door. And together they explained that while they would avoid dramatic language over the phone, they would, with my consent, implement an immediate administrative hold on the remaining assets, open a review of distributions for proper authorization, and coordinate with my attorney regarding any irregularities, particularly where signatures suggested a pattern that might be difficult to reconcile with the spirit of the fund, and I signed the forms with a steadiness that surprised even me, because for years my hands had learned to hover around money as if it were sacred when in our house it had always been sacrificial. There was a final document, a letter from my grandmother written in a tidy, patient hand and sealed for me after my graduation, which, according to the clerk, had been returned to the bank undelivered, and I slipped it into my bag without breaking the wax because there are some truths you do not read in fluorescent light with strangers leaning kindly over the counter, and also because a small, stubborn piece of me wanted to open it on a plane somewhere above clouds, a private ceremony to mark the moment when the sky stopped being metaphor and became logistics. By afternoon, I had booked my flight for 2 days earlier than planned, because when a house begins to dry out you should not loiter in the damp, and I spent the late hours moving in a practiced rhythm through rooms that had already begun to feel like a set, labeling cables and wrapping the framed print I bought with my first overtime check, deleting automatic renewals and forwarding mail, leaving behind the inexpensive furniture I never loved and the elaborate guilt I will not miss, and with every small task the future came into focus like a landscape released from fog, solid and inevitable and mine. At dusk, I dressed in something that could pass in any room and drove to the community center where my mother's charity committee was hosting a dessert auction for some cause she adored more as a stage than a mission. And I stood near the back with a neutral smile while she floated through the crowd collecting compliments as if they were proof of virtue, and then, at the peak of her glow, a man in a blazer with a messenger bag approached her with the polite efficiency of a courier delivering flowers, only he was not carrying flowers. He was carrying a packet whose color I had chosen with malice aforethought, because the particular shade of legal tan reads like a drum roll in certain circles, and he asked for her by full name, confirmed her identity, and handed her a formal notice informing her of the trust review, the administrative hold, and the scheduled interview times along with an itemized list of distributions under question, and as the paper slid into her hand, the room did not go silent. It kept buzzing along with small talk and applause, which made it all the more delicious. Because there is a special satisfaction in serving consequences during someone else's performance and letting the show continue around them as if nothing had happened at all. When I stepped outside, the air had that metallic taste it gets before weather changes, and on my phone there were messages piling up in the family thread, a frantic mix of denial and bargaining and accusations wearing concern as a mask. Yet the one that held me still was a brief note from Elaine that contained no commentary, only a photograph of a safety deposit box receipt with my name on it and a date that preceded the first transfer out of the fund by exactly 1 week, and below it a line that said, with the grim satisfaction of a person who has waited too long to be believed, "She knew the letter existed and tried to claim it before you did," which told me that whatever waited inside that sealed note from my grandmother would not only explain the past, but also force a choice about the future that might reshape the meaning of leaving. And I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat like a quiet passenger, keeping my eyes on the road while a question unfolded beside me. That? No tidy revenge could answer. At the airport, the fluorescent hush of early morning made everything feel suspended, as if the day had agreed to hold its breath while I decided whether to be the person who finally left or the person who stayed to supervise the fallout. And I stood at the counter with my passport open and the envelope from the bank tucked under my arm like a fragile animal I was afraid to startle, because for all my big talk I understood that one letter could recalibrate the story I had built to survive. And I wanted to read it in a place that reminded me the world was wider than a dining room that smelled of candles and performance. So I walked to a gate with a view of sleeping planes and a carpet patterned like an unconvincing forest. And with the boarding call still an hour away, I broke the wax seal as carefully as if it could bleed, and my grandmother's handwriting rose from the page with the patient certainty of a person who had left instructions on how to find daylight in a house that loved its shadows. She told me that when she was young, my mother learned to equate control with affection, that praise was a currency she spent only when it bought obedience, and that she had created the fund not simply to pay my tuition, but to give me an exit ramp no one else could close, a way to choose my life without bargaining for permission at a table where permission arrived wrapped in conditions. She wrote that if the account showed irregularities, I should resist the urge to confront in the old style, with scenes and speeches, and instead choose what she called clean endings, which in our family would look like paperwork and quiet signatures, and a refusal to rehearse the same fight in different rooms. Inside the second page was a key taped to the margin with brittle cellophane, and a small note that the bank would hold a safety deposit box under my name containing original documents, and one item that belonged to my mother before control taught her to rewrite her own childhood. And with that line, I felt the floor tilt a little, because the consonants of regret are heavy even on the dead, and I realized my grandmother had not only built me a bridge, but also left a stone in my pocket to remind me what the river could do if I tried to wade back through it. I checked the time and, calculating that I could risk a dash across the street to the branch that opened at dawn, I jogged out past the taxi stand where drivers traded gossip like weather. And within 10 minutes I was sitting in a small room where the ceiling tiles looked like winter sky, watching a clerk place a box on a felt pad with the reverence of a stagehand setting down a prop that changes the third act. The item wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of old closets, was a music box shaped like a house with peeling blue paint, and when I lifted the lid, a simple melody stumbled out in a loop. And beneath the mechanism lay a Polaroid that captured my mother at an age where her smile did not yet ask for witnesses, holding the same music box with my grandmother's arm around her like a promise. And on the back, in the neat block letters of a teacher, someone had written, "For her girl, when the house feels smaller than her lungs," and I sat with it long enough to feel the strange double pulse of pity and anger, because it is unnerving to discover that the person who raised you on rationed affection had once been rationed herself. There were also original trust papers that placed my name unmistakably where later copies had learned to substitute euphemisms, and a signed note from the bank manager who had retired a decade ago explaining the process for restoring control in the event of discrepancies. And by the time I returned to the terminal with the key in my pocket and the music box in my tote, I had the kind of calm that makes phone calls dangerous for people who try to weaponize panic, so I rang my father first. Because fairness matters even when history says it will not be returned, and I told him I had everything I needed to complete the administrative handoff, that investigators would handle the arithmetic, and that he should choose honesty while it was still cheap. He cried the way someone cries when relief ambushes them at the same moment as exposure, and he said he had signed things he did not read because peace is a seductive word in a loud house, which is not an absolution, but at least it was a sentence in plain language, and plain language has been a scarce commodity among us. Boarding began while my mother's name flashed across my screen in a relentless ring that suggested emergency, and I let it go to voicemail because I was not interested in her theater, yet curiosity is a flexible creature. And at the top of the jet bridge, I listened long enough to hear a version of contrition that sounded like a workshop draft, a string of phrases about misunderstandings and timing and how the money had always been intended for family, followed by a sentence that snagged on my ribs, because she said my departure would ruin her reputation when a quiet arrangement might salvage it, and that if I returned for a final conversation she would consider an apology, which is a kind of math only tyrants think will balance. I put the phone on airplane mode and stepped into a cabin that smelled of coffee and new carpet, and as I buckled in I realized that my last act of revenge would be the only one she could neither perform nor undo, an act my grandmother would have called a clean ending, because the trust would be repaired, yes, and the review would proceed, yes, and whatever consequences arrived would arrive with official letterhead rather than slogans. But the part that would draw a circle she could not step outside of was simple. I had already arranged to convert the remainder, once restored, into a scholarship under my grandmother's name that would be awarded without ceremony to girls who wanted more than permission, with a clause that prevented any family influence. A structure designed to outlive this argument and starve the old playbook by making it irrelevant. As the plane pushed back and the runway lights threaded past like beads, I took the music box from my bag and, without opening it, traced the chipped roof with my thumb, wondering whether the sound it made for my mother had ever been allowed to play to the end. And I thought about turning around, about staging one last showdown with definitions and tears, because a part of me still likes fireworks even when the power has already been cut, but the truth is that some victories look like leaving without applause, and some answers arrive as a question you decide not to ask. When the wheels lifted and the city folded into a map, I chose to adopt my grandmother's vocabulary and call this a clean ending rather than a triumphant one. And yet I could not help wondering what would happen when my mother opened the notice about the scholarship and saw the name that bypassed hers, whether she would finally hear that small struggling melody from the box she once held, or whether she would simply raise a glass somewhere, tell the room a story where I remained the reliable villain, and laugh until the music stopped, while on another continent a girl with a letter in her pocket boarded a bus and did not ask anyone's permission to breathe.